I want to give a really warm welcome to Gamal Palmer.
It's always fun when people are clapping for you. I'd say keep going, but I want to clap for you actually, because you have taken your Friday night or evening to be here and to do actually what you just said, which is to have a conversation together, to speak with each other. So I really strongly encourage you to, say whatever you want to say when you're compelled to. I mean, raising a hand might help just so I can, direct my energy to you. I am Gamal Palmer, and before I start, or I want to ask you a question. Has anybody here ever thought of themselves or imagined to be a superhero? Yes? Okay. And did that ever involve flying? Yes? Okay. Great. So I want you to just close your eyes for a moment. And if you feel uncomfortable closing your eyes in the room with other people, that's okay. You can pretend like you're closing your eyes because you're a superhero. And I want you to imagine what kind of superhero you would be today. And maybe you already occurred to yourself as a superhero. And as you imagine that, what is your special superhero power? And you can even think of a name too, because that's actually kind of fun and it helps you come up with your superhero power. Okay, so has everybody got one, or sort of, kind of? Close enough. Okay, so who are you as a superhero? You can open your eyes now. Who are you as a superhero?
Super smart, kind of like CIA agent.
Oh, nice. Okay, just kind of like nobody really knows that you can hear like 10 languages and yeah, okay, got it. Okay, got it. Okay, and anybody else superhero? Yeah?
I'm Impossible Man.
Impossible Man.
I show people that you can do the impossible on a regular basis.
That's great. That's great.
And impossible things.
Awesome. And what's your name?
I'm Will.
Will, okay. And yes?
I'm a superhero that comes in when people need me, and they make sense of their feelings.
Okay.
Down there.
Oh, you get us clear.
That's what
Sorry. Oh, wow.
We should talk.
Yes, and then talk to me, because I need some clarity. Superhero? Or power?
The superpower is being able to read minds.
Yes. And I have a feeling you have that very well to a T. Okay, so when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a superhero that could fly. I didn't have a name, I wasn't like the awesome G power, but I grew up in a place in Philadelphia called West Mount Airy, and it's actually still known as one of the most sustained middle-class neighborhoods in America. That is like one of the most diverse neighborhoods. That is a middle-class neighborhood I grew up with biracial families, which is actually why my parents moved there. My mother is Caucasian and my father is African-American descent and Native American. I grew up in the 90s there where there were lesbian families who, at that time that was really rare to, so I actually babysat parents of kids of lesbian families and Jewish families and Christian families, and so it's a really special place. And with that, I felt like that was a place, as I got to know the X-Men, that nurtured superheroes, right? And the house that I grew up in was one of these old East Coast houses with a lot of woodwork and banisters and baseboards that I'd have to clean every Sunday morning, but we're not going to talk about that. And you could see the skylight, right? So if you're at the first floor, you could see the skylight at the top to the third floor, and I just imagined that I would be able to just kind of float up and go through the skylight and just look over this entire neighborhood and see all of these mini superheroes. And for some reason, I knew that it was a special place, even at a really young age. I knew that there was something different about the neighborhood that I was growing up in in comparison to other neighborhoods. And so that got me really curious about people. And it got me really curious about the stories that we have and what's happening in those other homes on the block. And what are the kinds of conversations that they're having? And what is their family like, right? What are the dreams that are being nurtured inside of that house? So that curiosity and ability to fly, at age 12, was in 8th grade, and I joined a theater group. And it was an improvisational theater group. And we would go into schools or into retirement homes or other agencies with foster children, and we would do these kind of like improvisational workshops with them to help them grapple with whatever the issue is, that particular institution needed to grapple with. And so my first assignment, so this was an intergenerational theater group, right? So the oldest person, her name was Doris, and she was 86. And I was the youngest person at the time. I was the youngest company member. And so the idea was that you would always have a mixed age group coming to each workshop. And the young guy that was supposed to go on this one assignment canceled at the last minute. So they called me in, and I had never, done this before. I think I'd gone to like one rehearsal. And they called me and said, "Hey, do you want to work? Do you want to go?" And I said, "Sure." And I got to miss school, and everything was great. And so they said, "Yeah, it's in a mid-level security prison." And I was like, "Great." Because while I was excited and interested, I still had all of these ideas that I had been taught, these things that I had learned about what it would be like to go into a prison. So that mixed bag of fear and excitement, because I know that I'm a superhero, and if there's any problem that happens, I'll just fly away. I showed up to the prison, and nobody told me that you can't wear shorts and a tank top when you go to a prison because it can be provocative to inmates. And I'm in 8th grade, so I'm like, okay. I'm not sure what that means, but I just know that I don't have the right clothes on, right? And I only had a library card for an ID. So we worked some stuff out, and I borrowed a pair of pants from somebody in the car, and then I was given a prison shirt to wear and went into the workshop, right? Yes, it was kind of funny. And what I remember the most about this experience is at the end of the workshop. We had two, one with women and one with men. And there was a guy who was sitting in the back of the room, and he was the epitome of what I imagined a person in prison would look like. So I made him, in my imagination, really scary. And I just was afraid that any moment that this person was gonna get up and, be angry or do one of the things that I had seen on TV that people in prison do. And at the end of the workshop, when everyone was, saying what they got, this gentleman raised his hand and he said, "I want to thank you because for an hour I felt like I wasn't in prison no more." And that just penetrated my heart. And he became one of my first mentors. Now, I didn't know it at the time that he was my mentor. I just knew that I had this experience that empowered me as a superhero. And at that point, I was ready to do anything. And so I got more involved in theater, and I was doing these shows with this theater company all the time. And life cycles happen, and I go to high school, and then I end up going to college to study acting. And the whole time, I'm going back and forth between, do I want to be this main stage famous actor, and on movies, or do I want to do community for social change and social justice work? And, and I was just constantly going back and forth. So I finally learned that you could actually do both. right? And in college, I had a teacher. Her name was Patricia Gross. And Patricia Gross was like, she was like an Irish superhero, you know? And, you know, she taught me that you can actually use theater and you can write plays about these experiences that you have with people, and you can become them. And you don't have to do plays that are scripted, you know, by somebody else. And that you can actually go out into the community and really collect people's stories and come back and do something with them. And so as I started collecting these ideas from Patricia, I created a one-man show. And I went out and I collected stories from people in Miami. I was going to school in Miami. And I created a play called Freedom Now. And it was a story of black men who were standing on this corner store outside of University of Miami, and they were telling me these stories about how they weren't even allowed on the campus, right? And so I spent a lot of time collecting stories with this group of men that would stand on this corner. And I collected these stories, and I was so proud that I was going to perform this play. And it was like my first play that I had written, and my first like one-man show that I had done. And, you know, I had worked so hard on it, and I created a whole, you know, audience of people to come and see it. And I was there to really celebrate these men who, you know, were going to have an opportunity to be heard through me, right, as a vessel. And I performed the play, and at the end, I go to Patricia, and I say, well, what do you think? What did you think, right? And she just looked at me and said, love your work. I was like, that's not the answer I wanted to hear. I want to know what you think. I want you to affirm me. I want you to tell me it was amazing, right? And as I'm driving home on my bike, I started thinking more and more, what does this mean? What does this mean? And a cop car stops me. I hear like the whoop, whoop, you know? And so this police officer says, please get off the bike. Like, there's nobody on the road, right? So he says on his speaker to get off the bike. So I get off the bike. And he says, what are you doing with this bike? And I said, oh, I'm just driving home. And I was literally like where I live, pretty much in the closed area where I live. And you know, he said, what are you doing with this bike? And I said, well, I'm just going home. And he said, okay, can I see some ID? And I was like, okay, sure. So I showed the man my ID. And he said, you really go to University of Miami? I said, yes, sir, I go to University of Miami. And so we went back and forth, and he went to his car, and you know, he called in my name, I guess. I don't know if you can do that with a college ID or not. Not sure if it's enough information. And then he said, okay, you can go on your way. And I said, thank you very much. Upset, angry. I mean, here I was, I had just like had this liberating experience, and I had told these stories of these men who live in this neighborhood. And that's when Patricia's advice really hit me. Love your work. Because it wasn't about me and whether I did a good job or not. It's about celebrating humanity and giving voice to people who may not ordinarily have the opportunity to be heard. And so with that, I really started thinking about, okay, like, what is the impact that I want to have on this planet? And I had actually forgotten about my first mentor. I'd forgotten about that experience in 8th grade when I went to the prison, and heard this man thank us for having him forget that he was in this place, in this jail. And so that really took me on a journey. It took me on a journey to start really exploring all the different ways that people use the arts, whether it's visual arts or acting, you know, or sculpting, you know, or graphic design to tell the stories of people and of the human condition. And I know that we have people here who are artists, right? Who do the impossible, who read people's minds, right? Yes. And so what I would like for tonight to be is a conversation about how we can really shape our communities with our superpowers. How we can look at the experiences that we've had, right? And connect the dots. So that way we can actually continue to fuel our superpowers, right? And then to use them for our communities and for transformation. So as you're thinking about that, which I'm encouraging you to do, and you're hearing me speak, I'd like you to ask yourself, is there a place in your life right now or in your work where you actually get to use arts or your creativity to have an impact on your community? Right? So you're saying yes, you do. And that's through
Through the Move the World Dance Activism Group, but also through teaching and teaching youth primarily is what
Mhm.
I've been doing. But, you know, imparting what I know, but also inspiring them to use who they are and what they already are
Yeah.
to express the things they want to express.
Right. And that's the key part, right, is using who they already are and having them see that they have this unique quality, this unique gift. Can anybody relate with her, with what she's sharing? Yes. And how do you use?
Well, inside of creativity, like actually I work with teams of people, and so and having them bring their creativity and how to solve problems.
Right.
So that's how I bring the arts to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Every day in the hospital, constantly trying to create innovative ways of creating better care, making the patient experience better. Create little love animals for the kids.
Uh-huh.
Just whatever we can do to make a vulnerable, painful situation better.
Yeah. I mean, that is such a gift, right? We can laugh, but to have somebody in the hospital in that situation to make a puppet out of a glove, right? And just to bring that smile even for a moment is really a transformative experience, right?
One smile is what makes my day.
Yeah.
One smile, if I get one smile for the whole shift is what makes my day.
Yeah. Yeah. So as it was mentioned earlier, I created this course called The Social Quest for Justice Through Music, Theater, and Religion. And another one of the superheroes of my life is a man called Mgunga. And he lives in Tanzania. He's from Tanzania. And I went to Tanzania for the first time in 2010. And Mgunga grew up outside of Dar es Salaam in a suburban area. And he's a very philosophical man, right? And Mgunga had an idea that he really needed to do something for the kids on the streets. They call them street kids or slum kids in Dar es Salaam. And Mgunga was into music and the arts, and so he decided, well, wouldn't it be great if we took Tanzanian sonnets and made them into hip-hop? So in Tanzania, hip-hop is called bongo flavor, right? And in Swahili, bongo flavor means blood and brains. And so in the streets in Tanzania, you have to have blood and brains to survive. And so for them, hip-hop was this outlet, just the same as in America when hip-hop first started. It was an outlet for people to express who they were and to tell their story to the world through beats and through words. And it took a lot of brain power to be able to actually speak that poetry off the cuff, right? I mean, no rehearsal, freestyle, and to tell an entire world, an experience, just by seeing what's right in front of you. So Mgunga created a troupe called Parapanda, and he started, this workshop, taking Tanzanian sonnets and putting it into hip-hop or bongo flavor. And kids were starting to come to these workshops, and Mgunga thought, he was his own kind of superhero, right? So he had it all covered, and he was going to use the arts and transform the world. And as he started to engage with these kids through bongo flavor and Tanzanian sonnets, he realized he doesn't actually know what these kids need. He doesn't know who they are. He just knows that they're kids who are on the streets, who don't have families for whatever reason, or maybe they do, but their fathers are working in the mines, or, their mother's got to work late night at a bar or, at a school. So Mgunga decided the best way for him to really have the impact that he wanted to have and to create a community of transformation was to move into the community. So he moved out of his suburban area and he lived in the slums for 7 years. And in those 7 years, he was developing this idea of taking poetry and stories and turning them into theater plays. And he created a process called what he calls the Theater for Social Change process. And the Theater for Social Change process involves people, whether you're actors or not, going into the community and actually collecting stories from those people, knocking on doors and saying, we want to talk to you about waste management. And people say, what? Right? You want to talk about what? Right? I mean, he's engaging with people who are really just focusing on their basic needs. Food, shelter, making sure they have water, making sure that they have clothes. And all of a sudden, there were people knocking on the door saying, we want to talk to you about abuse in the education system. And it wasn't like the NGO people, the people like myself who really care and get involved and join initiatives and that are not from that country and they just want to do good for the world. They were their own people, so they were seeing themselves. And as he developed this process, he would collect these stories and then he'd go back to his home. I was going to call it a studio, but he didn't have a studio yet. And they would look to see what was an actual issue that people were saying versus a root cause. And he really spent a lot of time trying to distinguish an issue from a root cause. And then what are the consequences, right? Like, what are the consequences from this issue? So you have the root cause, then there's the issue that comes up, and then there's the consequence. And then he started asking, well, wait a minute, okay, so we understand the consequences, but who's actually responsible for, for these consequences, right? So, well, what are some solutions? So he's like, okay, so we have the root cause, we have issues, we have consequences, and then we have solutions. Great. So he went back out and he started creating these plays, and these plays wouldn't change the stories that he collected, which I think is, really brilliant. You would actually have to retell the story through this theater, through this form of theater, and you'd perform it for the people of that community. And then he realized, well, wait a minute, we have the solutions, but who's actually responsible for instituting those solutions? Who's the person? Who's the one? So he developed this over time, and the Theater for Social Change process that he has is now something that is used widely throughout Tanzania. And people from all over the world come to work with Mgunga. And I have learned that we can afford to take more time to understand these processes and to ask these questions. And are we actually the one? Is it my superpower that you need, right? Or is it someone else's, right? And so Mgunga said to me that, Gamal, these people, they just want to be heard. They want to be free, and they want to be the ones to free themselves. And if we can create any opportunity for them to be empowered, to know that they're heard, and for them to feel like they're free to say what they want to say, then they can actually be the ones to take the actions, to institute the solutions, and to create the transformative environments or communities that we all want them to have and we want to have in our own communities. And so I'm curious here if any of you find roadblocks in the work that you do in terms of having impact on your communities. Yes?
Policies,
Yeah.
hospital policies, all the time. Trying to implement change is difficult on any unit. Because you think of a great idea that'll just move things right along, and it will take months, in fact, years to just get it even started.
Right. Yeah. So it's really about building the community around the policy, right? So it's like you have to work with the policy and still at the same time not be stopped by it. So you create your micro communities, right? And you kind of go in another way, and maybe you're not going to make that big leap of change or transformation, but it's those smaller steps.
And you have to trust your team, because
Right.
without your team, it all falls apart, even if you do have the acceptance and permission from the top people.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
Our culture of busyness, there's never enough time to have the conversations because there's such a level of addiction to distraction, of busyness.
Right.
There isn't time to bring it into full flower so that there can be the change that people really long for.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that competing intention of, I really want it to be different, but I don't have time to.
Right. I want to do this, but I don't have time. Or I want to do this, but I'm paying attention to something else right now. Yeah. The age of the iPod. Yeah. So, with the work that we do with Mgunga and the work that I do with my theater company in New York that we mentioned earlier to mission the conversation around skin tone, prejudice, and race, we're constantly realizing that the answer is actually in just talking to the people that we want to have the impact with and creating those solutions with them. We often, because we're dealing with a bureaucracy or with an upper level management, can sometimes forget that they actually have answers that we can really thrive from, right? And that we can make some differences or some change or some impact that we hadn't thought of. And the other superhero that I want to tell you about his name is Musa Zigalala. And Musa lives in Swaziland. And he was born with very intense asthma. So when he was young, he would say, he'd speak like, "Can I have some water?" Right? And so over the years, he's been able to develop through speech therapy and whatever other kinds of therapy he's needed for his lungs to be able to speak more clearly, but you can still hear the raspiness, right? You can still hear the asthma. And I was staying with Musa in Swaziland. He lives on what they call location. And location is sort of like in apartheid time, there were these settlements where the black people were told that they could live there, and then there was the main areas. And so those structures are still in place, even though it's called that, even though you still can move freely. And so Swaziland is an independent country that's landlocked around South Africa, for those who don't know. And so, I'm sleeping at Musa's house, and he wakes me up one morning and he says, "Sabelo, Sabelo." So my Swazi name is Sabelo, which means keeper of the state. And that was the name that the community gave to me. And so he says, "Sabelo, we must collect the rocks. Come, we must collect the rocks." And I'm like, "What?" Right? And so he wakes me up and I throw some water on my face and we go outside. And he says, "Come, a man must walk, a man must work and walk." right? And so I'm walking and working at like 6 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. And we walk up the hill, and Musa's property on the homestead is one of the largest properties there. And the kind of person that he is, and why he is a superhero to me, is that Musa, he is a creator. He's an artist. And people, kids, parents, it's like magnetic. I think that his superpower, if he were to say he had one, or if I were going to tell him he had one, is one of magnetism. People you just want to be with Musa. And so he always has kids playing on the property, and parents coming over just to talk to his mama, right? And his family actually is in charge of the well, so they have the key to the well. Each location, there's maybe 1 or 2 wells, and there's someone who is responsible for the key, and you bring, a change to get water. And so that's the kind of family and environment, right, that he had created and his family created. And we get to the top of this hill, and we look down at the plot of land, and he says, "You see, we building theater." And I said, "What?" Right? It's like I heard him, but I wasn't getting it. And he said, "We building theater." And I looked down and I saw that on the side of his house, he had already started digging out the wall of the hill to build an amphitheater. And he said, "This is where the people will come and they will tell their stories, Sabelo. So we must collect the rocks." So I started picking up rocks and collecting rocks. And at the time I was teaching a course called Arts in Action, Theater and Public Health in Swaziland. And at the time in 2007, around then, 29% of Swaziland was infected with HIV. So that's 1 out of every 4 persons was infected. And the country was traumatized. Literally, kids would come home and their parents would be on the floor, asleep forever. And so there was a missing generation of people, right? And Musa just wanted all of these kids to have a home. And he wanted them to be able to tell their stories. When we did a Theater for Social Change-like process in Swaziland, the one thing that we heard from people was that they wanted a place to go to think. Because so many people live in such small structures together that they weren't actually able to process, "I lost my mom. My grandmother is dead. My son is gone." You just keep moving. You keep operating. So they wanted like think gardens, meditation gardens. And so for Musa, this theater was going to be a think garden. It was going to be a transformative storytelling garden where people could come and celebrate who they are, whether it's the loss of life or the gaining of education or joy. And so I said to Musa, "If you build this, then we will make the entire program about you and about this place." And he said, "Sabelo, it's not about me. It's not about you. It doesn't matter whether you're in Brazil or you're in South Africa or Swaziland or anywhere. You're making art, and it all goes to the art. It all goes to the one art like this." And so what I think Musa was saying was that we are conduits for transformation. We are conduits for transforming and creating our communities and taking the actions that we know how to take to have that impact. And then once we create it, it goes to this collective space. It goes to something that is way beyond us, beyond you, beyond me. And it's not about us, right? It's just loving the work. Like my mentor Patricia said, just love your work. right? Love that process that you go through, you know? And speaking with Mgunga, he sacrificed himself to go and understand how to transform that community. And he is now, just like Musa, has thriving theaters and is constantly giving himself away so that he can create a creative garden for people to come and share their stories and to be free and to find their own superpower and use it and tell you about it and be empowered by that and then go and share it with someone else. So I want to encourage you all to continue developing your superpowers and keep being proud of the superhero that you are. And we will continue to shape the world and make a difference. Thank you.